On November 26th, Pakistan's security forces, including police, rangers, and soldiers, committed a massacre of peaceful protesters gathered in Islamabad for their democratic and human rights and the release of their leader, Imran Khan, who has been arbitrarily imprisoned for more than a year. This brutal crackdown resulted in hundreds feared murdered or missing, and hundreds or even thousands by some accounts injured. Meanwhile, Pakistan's corrupt political and military leaders are attempting to cover up the atrocities and even going as far as denying that any protesters were shot at. In this video, we will outline the events of the massacre and share evidence of the crimes committed. Prior to the massacre itself, the fascist Pakistani regime cracked down on protesters by arresting thousands before the protest started on November 24th, placed hundreds of containers on the roads to Islamabad and throughout the city, and used intense tear gas shelling and baton charges to disperse protesters once the protest began. By the night of November 25th, Pakistan's Interior Minister Mohsin Naqvi said that the regime could disperse crowds using live bullets. Shortly after, the first reports of Pakistani forces firing directly at peaceful protesters emerged from near Noor Hospital in Islamabad, during which around 20 protesters were critically injured. On Tuesday, November 26th, the fascist Pakistani regime deployed the army in Islamabad with shoot-on-sight orders, which international human rights groups such as Amnesty International condemned and asked the government to rescind immediately. Throughout the day, Pakistan's security forces continued to brutally push back protesters as they moved towards D Chowk, a central protest location in Islamabad close to important government buildings, using tear gas and direct firing, even using snipers, all of which were caught on videos on the ground during the day. The government manufactured consent for their brutality on protesters by claiming that they had weapons, but Al Jazeera journalist Kamal Haider said that no evidence of this was found, and the sounds of AK-47s could be heard in video footage even as he was reporting on the ground.
Government said these were armed protesters, but we did not see any evidence of any arms being carried by the protesters. They're using live assault rifles. These are Kalashnikovs, AK-47. They're using, as you can hear that. Supporters of Imran Khan who have been on the road braving the police bullets and tear gas have finally made it to T-Square.
The government also claimed that security personnel were killed by protesters, a claim that was refuted by senior independent journalist Matiullah Jan. By Tuesday night, even more concerning reports emerged from the area where protesters were gathered near D Chowk. Activists on the ground such as Ahmed Farhad used social media to share about the violence as it began, but internet and VPN access was also cut off to prevent protesters from widely sharing the atrocities as they happened. As days have gone by, reports of what happened have been confirmed by activists, protesters, and journalists. Essentially, all the lights in the area near D Chowk, including on containers, were turned off, after which security forces on the ground began indiscriminately firing at the protesters, and snipers from roofs of nearby buildings started shooting as well. The containers which PTI leaders were on were set on fire, and as soon as people started seeing dead bodies falling around them, they began to flee the area near D Chowk. Some of the dead bodies and those who were injured were taken to nearby hospitals, while some of the people who were transporting martyrs back to their hometowns were intercepted by the military and arrested. The Guardian, the BBC, and independent journalists on the ground reported that nearby hospitals had patients with gunshot wounds and that security personnel were surrounding the hospitals. A doctor who spoke to the Guardian in the emergency ward of one of the hospitals on Tuesday night shared that he had treated more than 40 injured patients, several of whom had been shot. He also said all records of dead and injured have been confiscated by the authorities. We are not allowed to talk. Senior government officials are visiting the hospital to hide the records. Doctors speaking to the BBC also revealed more concerning details from the night of the massacre. One doctor said he had not done so many surgeries in one night until that night, while another doctor said some of the injured were in such critical conditions that they had to start their surgeries instead of waiting for them to be given anesthesia. Doctors also shared that they were under pressure from the police to hand over the injured, and several doctors shared that dozens of PTI workers with bullet wounds asked for their names to not be put out on the record out of fear that they too would be arrested. Matiullah Jan, who, as mentioned earlier, was key in refuting the claim that security personnel were killed by protesters, which was essential to the government's justification of brutality against them, was abducted from the parking lot of one of the hospitals where injured protesters were taken, and a fabricated case was launched against him to continue to silence him. Shakir Awan, another journalist who was reporting on the atrocities, was also abducted. Further evidence of the atrocities, including video footage, have been released by independent journalists, and as mentioned previously, eyewitnesses, including protesters and journalists, have have also come forward and confirmed that security forces used straight fire on peaceful protesters. Lists of people who are still missing, arrested, or who have been confirmed to have been killed are being compiled, and the government still refuses to acknowledge or accept responsibility for what happened. Pakistanis throughout the country and the world are demanding answers and accountability for all the atrocities that were inflicted upon innocent, unarmed protesters by the fascist Pakistani regime. However, due to the intense cover-up which took place in the hours after the massacre and these past few days, the full scale of the atrocities and harm caused by Pakistani security forces might never be confirmed. BTI has created a response cell to collect information about the massacre and help the victims and their families get justice and accountability, while journalists and activists continue to collect and publish evidence online. Share this video to help us raise awareness.